Liz has read and you recommended the book. This is news to me too.
No, it's Sarah Adair's book that I have.
That was the book, okay.
Which is her.
But, and I'm hoping to republish that with an edited introduction.
Oh, okay.
But this
that would
talk
help.
is about the League of Women Voters and social reform, and we were important a century ago. So, knock on wood, maybe we'll be important again. That is the optimism. So, please tell us. Well, I'm gonna be lots more important.
Well, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here, and certainly the League of Women Voters has a long and storied history. So just briefly.
Oh, that's right.
Oh,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
Oh, we are. Okay, I am Joan Martinez, and I've been with the League forever. You've met Diana.
Hi, I'm Diana Doyle. Thanks for coming tonight to my house. And I've been only a member of about a year, and I've been recruited to be the new treasurer.
Yay!
So that's it. Thanks for being here.
I'm Dorothy Martesian, and I've been off and on again member, but I'm currently a member for the last, I don't know, few years.
Okay.
Yeah, Holly, okay, I'll go ahead. I'm Liz Head, and I've been president of the Providence League, what seems like forever, since at least 2011. And I joined in DC and was on the DC Home Rule Committee, where we also put together a parade and got pushed off the front page of the Washington Post because Nixon chose that time to bomb Cambodia. So anyway, so I'm well aware of those kinds of things. But we're working now on just a few things, particularly coming up, and I'll let you all know. The National League has proposed a short, quick time frame study of the federal judicial system. And we are going to have a consensus meeting, and we'll get the information out to you. Get a consensus meeting April 1st. It's a Tuesday of that week. And at my house, okay, 603 Angel Street. So anybody who's interested can please attend that too.
Okay, I'm Martha Fucci. I've been in about as long as all these ladies have been in.
Oh no, Martha. I'm Holly Courage, and you were one of the people that was standing outside the nursery, the classroom at the nursery school, and were out there recruiting me to join the league at that point.
That was a long time ago.
That was a long time. These children are now in their almost 50. These children are almost 50. But yes, I have been in the league for a long time, and I have been Providence president and state president. And now I'm attempting to be only doing minor things.
I'm Mary Frances Cooper, and I've been a member of the Providence League for about 3 years.
I'm Mary Wright. I actually joined the league in the 80s in Richmond, Virginia, and then moved on to Des Moines, Iowa, and then I was in Milton, Massachusetts League. And when I retired, I joined the Providence League.
And we're glad to have you.
I'm Helen Walsh, and I'm only about a year in it.
I'm a friend of the league. going on this. I used to go to meetings with my stepmother in the 70s.
Kathy is an absolutely essential ally. We have had conversations with the House Museum that have been astoundingly informative and well attended, and it's been the most gracious spot. So,
And we hope to do so again we love partnering with the league, so thank you very much for having me.
Okay. Elisa.
Thanks. It's okay. So I'm the chair of the Department of History, and I also teach American history, but my specific specialty is American women's and gender history, particularly of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. So suffrage fits in very nicely there. So I had gotten into the Rhode Island suffrage movement around 2016 as part of, I was the Rhode Island state coordinator for this national project called the Online Biographical Dictionary of the Women's Suffrage Movement that ultimately produced around 3,700 short bios of unheralded women's history. It was an act of social history, so it's not Susan B. Anthony or Alva Belmont, but people like Sarah Algeo that most people have not heard of before. In the back of my handout, there's QR codes either to get to the biographical dictionary, or Holly very kindly actually created a League of Women Voters webpage where you can go directly to the Rhode Island suffragists. So what I wanted to talk to today is that in 2020, at the 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment, it was really heartening to see women's suffrage get a lot more of attention, rather than just a little box in a textbook or a throwaway mention on Women's History Month. But what did strike me is everyone was talking about suffrage just as a civil rights issue, about women needing to have the same political rights as men. And no one was really talking about why they wanted to vote and why they spent so much of their lives, their time, their money fighting for this. And I think that's been an overlooked part. And at the core of the most prominent parts of the suffrage movement, and then the League of Women Voters, were this idea that women could do tremendous social good with the vote. And that the vote was more a tool to get to the social reform that they passionately wanted. The vote was a means and not the end. And so I think it's important to understand both why they felt so strongly about that, but then how they implemented those goals into the League of Women Voters as well. So in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, in the country as a whole, but particularly in places like Rhode Island, there was a lot of concern about the way the country was changing with industrialization, urbanization, and immigration, that the country was changing. For a lot of people, there was the concern that it wasn't for the better, and that in particular, these women reformers felt that it put women and children at risk. So they saw increasing poverty, social divisions, people suffering, but then also it's their mindset. And this is something that historians often call maternalism. They had this faith that women were fundamentally different from men, that they saw them as more moral, more nurturing, more emotional, more religious than men. And so they would use the vote in different ways, that men were competitive or rational or selfish, but women, they believed, had the spirit of the mother. And so for some women that may be they were an actual mother, for other women they would mother the community. And so then you have people like Jane Addams, who never had any children of her own, but used that maternal, what she viewed as that maternal spirit, to serve poor people, workers, immigrants. So this idea of maternalism is really at the core of most of the mainstream women suffragists. And when I say mainstream, I mostly mean the ones that were associated with NASA. the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which had several different organizations in Rhode Island that they were affiliated with. The more radical groups connected with the National Women's Party tend to be more focused on legal issues and less on social reform. But for most of the NASA suffragists and those in Rhode Island, this idea that the vote was a tool that women would use in creative and important ways, essentially the idea is men created these problems and women will fix it because they have this maternal heart and can't take suffering. So just to give you some examples of this, Sarah L.G. Fitz, who was a Providence suffragist, she taught that American society was calling for mothering and that the enfranchising of women will be the salvation of the world. If you look at some of the concrete ways that they, let me just go back a second. Another suffragist, a really interesting woman who was both a suffragist and a socialist and ran a couple times for Rhode Island Secretary of State, Helen Doherty, she claimed the natural gentleness and unselfishness of women's nature will make her a more valuable voter in matters that affect society. So some of the particular ways that they put this into action: temperance, child labor, immigration reform, prohibition and temperance, both in Rhode Island and nationally, is probably the biggest issue that suffragists cared about. And it was less about alcohol in its own right and more the idea that alcohol was a gateway issue that led to a million other social ills, whether it's child labor or adultery, prostitution, gambling, crime. So it's not just that they were teetotalers, but they saw alcohol as something that engendered lots of different social problems. Both nationally and in Rhode Island, there was very strong connections between the temperance movement and suffrage. Elizabeth Upham Yates, a future president of the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association, spoke at a local women's Christian temperance union meeting in 1896, explaining that the WCTU was the greatest result of women's progress, and every woman should be deeply interested in the cause of temperance. She continued that temperance reform would help solve all of the other important problems now before the world. WCT members regularly spoke at the Rhode Island suffrage organizations and vice versa. They also lobbied together the Rhode Island legislature and governor in favor of various suffrage bills. Sarah Algio, and so the handout, normally if I was giving a talk, I'd have a PowerPoint of images. So this is, there's just some really great images that really drive home the idea that that protecting the home, the family, children was an important goal of suffrage. But Sarah Algio is one of these prominent Rhode Island women who is a leader in both suffrage and temperance efforts. The photograph that you see of her there, I just really love. Another women reformer gifted her with 2 puppies who she named Suffrage and Prohibition. And she said these dogs were worthy of the great reforms they signified and a splendid advertisement for both causes. The suffragists argued that with the right to vote, that women would vote for temperance politicians and the resulting temperance reform would improve American society dramatically. Deborah Knox Livingston was a suffragist and state president of the WCTU in Rhode Island before going on to becoming a prominent New England temperance leader. and then nationally served as chair of Suffrage for the national WCTU. Speaking at a Patuxent Valley WCTU meeting, she called for the enfranchisement of women, saying it offered the only hope for the enforcement of the liquor traffic, as well as the great social reforms before the people of this country, which she included child labor, crime, disease, education, and prostitution. She also wrote a song about suffrage and temperance called The Advancing Host that I'm not going to sing to you, but the chorus is, women want the vote, women want the vote, to bring in prohibition, women want the vote. Women want the vote, women want the vote, to make a sober nation, women want the vote. Helen Doherty, the socialist that I mentioned before, echoed these ideas about the connections between temperance and suffrage. She said that the question of women's suffrage, when it came up, the liquor interest fought it relentlessly. There was a reason. If a woman should ever get the right of franchise in Rhode Island, you could count on one thing for a surety, and that would be there would not be a liquor store on every corner. There would not be so many of them in the congested, wage-earning districts of Providence that are now permitted to do business. And in fact, the suffragists in Rhode Island claimed that the biggest supporter of anti-suffrage was the Narragansett Brewing Company. As with temperance, child labor was a common social issue that motivated women reformers and suffragists. Annie Barris, a Rhode Island suffrage activist, was also a state leader in the fight against child labor. She served as chairman of the Rhode Island Child Labor Committee, the Rhode Island Consumers League, and a chairman of the Rhode Island Women's Clubs. In public lectures, she charged that children as young as 5 and 6 were working in their homes in the jewelry industry, and that more than 6,000 children were working in Rhode Island factories. She accused Rhode Island of being a pioneer in child labor at Slater Mill in Pawtucket. As with temperance, Barris and other child labor activists believed that women could use the right to vote to fight against this social ill. In a suffrage debate series in 1912 in the Providence Journal, she argued that women needed the vote in order to protect these child workers, and said that women had potential motherhood that instinctively made them defensive to cherish and protect the race against the masculine incentive to utilize and exhaust.
Yeah.
Yes. There are several cartoons on the cover and within about how women would help things like infant mortality or protect clean food and water laws that were critical for the family. So it's both the idea that women were mothers of society as a whole, but even for actual mothers who had this social duty to protect their families and homes, if they couldn't feed their children clean food, if there wasn't, safe playgrounds, if there was, sewage, that affected her ability to protect her home and children. At a 1915 Women's Suffrage Forum, Helen R. Parks, one thing that I've noticed about Parks and her daughter is that one of the homes they lived in on the east side is now where my dentist is. Oh. So the history of suffrage is everywhere. She argued that women's suffrage was needed for pure food laws, including the great question of the milk supply. She argued that suffrage could help with issues such as proper housing, the removal of garbage, and other instances of municipal housekeeping which affect the home. All of the women that I've discussed thus far are white women. However, it's also important that Black women were active first in the suffrage movement and then in the League of Women Voters in Rhode Island as well. They shared many of the same ideas of women reformers protecting women and children and having a beneficial effect on society, but they also specifically viewed problems affecting African Americans and the issue of race. So they were working for temperance and against child labor, but they were also concerned about civil rights legislation, anti-lynching, vocational training for African Americans. Examples of these women, Bertha Higgins is one of these prominent, Black suffragists and club women. She regularly gave talks to audiences in Black churches and mother clubs, both about these social reforms, but also about the need for the vote. And you can see it's either 1911 or 1913, my brain is glitching for a second. But there's a Providence Journal article in there where she was hosting at a state meeting of Black club women. They had a debate about the women's, the right to the women, and at this conference, the Black club women endorsed it and said that women's suffrage is a cause that we support and will fight for. She argued that Black women could make an important difference in society, claiming that the colored ballot of our mothers, wives, and sweethearts will purify society on issues such as immorality and alcohol. Other prominent Black club women like Roberta J. Dunbar believed that Black women had a critical role to play in society and in the African American community through the home, and that as religious, moral, and nurturing leaders in the home, that this would be a critical way for improving the material conditions for African Americans, but also fighting against racism. In 1903, she gave a speech where she explained, "It's our glorious privilege to foster the home life and to so train the children that go from those homes as sturdy, intelligent American citizens. No race has risen to any greatness that has neglected the home life. It's the cornerstone of its prosperity. To be true, pure, noble, and have race pride should be the aim of every woman." So certainly there's a lot of overlap between the Black and white suffragists, but a very specific focus on civil rights for the Black women. They fought for suffrage both in their own organizations, but also the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Party was a rare interracial suffrage association that was affiliated with NASA. That was very unusual nationally. So both nationally in Rhode Island, the League of Women Voters emerged out of the women's suffrage movement, particularly NASA, in 1919. The purpose of the League of Women Voters, which I know I don't need to tell you, was to organize the final push to finalize the 19th Amendment, to register women to vote, and prepare and educate women for citizenship. However, much like the suffrage movement, maternalism and women's social reform was at the heart of the League of Women Voters. If you look at their national plank, is on the other page with the two women, you can see a list of their goals for the vote, but also kind of a mission statement which says that they're there for the betterment of women and children. At the 1919 NASA convention, President Carrie Chapman Catt talked about her vision for the League after suffrage. For years, she stated, "Women have labored to secure the vote as a tool with which to build a better nation. What could be more patriotic that these women should use their new freedom to make their nation safer for their children and their children's children?" The legislative agenda of the League in 1920, the year of the 19th Amendment, reflected this commitment to social reform, stating that their objectives was to demand and support legislation for the betterment of women and children. And if you turn the page, there's a 1922 article from the Providence Journal about a meeting of the Rhode Island League of Women Voters. And you can see all their reform agendas here. Continuation of their maternalist goals, that women had the responsibility, capability to protect women and children's interests. Here they're supporting temperance, prohibition, mothers and children health, mothers' pensions, which is essentially an early version of welfare to allow women to stay home with their young children. They're also supporting anti-lynching legislation, which shows the impact of Black women on the movement. Black women like Bertha Higgins and Roberta Dunbar were also important leaders in the early League of Women Voters in Rhode Island, and spoke in Black communities and fought for causes like anti-lynching. Anti-lynching legislation. Just one very quick story about Bertha Higgins, which I really like. So she's a prominent Black clubwoman here in Rhode Island, and yet her political impact was seen as so great that President Harding invited her to his inauguration in gratitude for her activism to help get him elected. I think it speaks a lot to the political influence of this Black woman to have a presidential candidate beholden to her. In 1932, something very similar happened with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. By the late 20s, early 1930s, many Black activists had changed from the Republican to the Democratic Party because they saw Roosevelt as a better supporter, and they were disenchanted by Republican politicians who had not followed through on civil rights activism. The women who led the women's suffrage movement to success in the early 20th century and founded the League of Women Voters felt a profound commitment as women to social reform activism. They devoted a great deal of time, money, and effort to achieving the right to vote and to try to use that vote to improve social conditions in the country. The question for women and the League of Women Voters today is how we can honor that tradition by ensuring that we recognize the power of the vote for affecting social change and for voting in the interests of women and children. 125 years later, in a very divided country and one facing many challenges, we have our work cut out for us. Thank you. And like I said, on the last page, there are websites and QR codes that you can just click with your camera if you want to read more of the individual files.
Just for anybody who doesn't know, Bertha Higgins is on our charter at the State House. And I think it's Dunbar, is the other one?
No, the other one was Rose Braddock. That was.
And at the centennial dinner that you were at.
Before the world.
Yeah.
Right. But at the original dinner in 1920, January 6, 1920, after the House and the General Assembly ratified the 19th Amendment, and they ratified it. It was the first thing on the agenda. It was a whole new thing to have that happen. They had been promised by the governor and the Speaker of the House, and that's how they pestered them.
For sure.
Crazy. And lobbied, pestered, whatever. Where was I going with that? Anyway, that was the first agenda item, and it was passed, and there were some great cartoons that were on the in the Providence Journal after that passed.
Back when they did
you have them
cartoons.
in here? Huh?
Back when they did cartoons. I was curious about the African American men in Rhode Island. And, you know, because when you think about 1911 nationally, Black people didn't easily vote. So that there were Black women arguing for the vote in Rhode Island. Do you have any sense of how engaged Black men in Rhode Island were in?
Wasn't Bertha Higgins' husband a city councilman in Providence?
He was a prominent physician.
Yeah.
That's sort of one class of people. I'm just
Yeah.
curious about in general.
So it's interesting. So Black men in Rhode Island do have the right, you know, to vote, whereas they don't in the South. And generally, both in the North and the South, Black men and Black women are seen as very united on the vote. In the North, you have support both from Black men and Black women, thinking it'll be good for the community and civil rights as a whole. But then in the South, what you see are Black women taking the lead because Black men really can't. That they're seen as so threatening and their lives are so much at risk. It was easier for women to kind of carry the torch for the vote for everyone because men were very vulnerable.
Right.
But it was seen as a joint thing and not like an individual right that just Black men or just Black women would use to advance themselves.
But Keith Stokes down in Newport, he does a lot of Black history, and when the centennial was coming up, it was really very frustrating that he said, this is, the Black community supported women's suffrage. And then he went on to talk about how his grandfather had supported this. And I kept saying, well, do you have any stories about what the women did? And he says, I'll get back to you. And he never did. It was just that his grandfather had supported the women's suffrage. And that was all the stories that he put onto Facebook online. They were all about the men doing things. So I don't know whether that's just his current bias or whether that was how they did things back then. I don't know.
So Sunny Stokes, who is Keith's wife, is the director of the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. Their archives right now are at Rhode Island College. They do have Bertha Higgins papers there. I have not gotten a chance to look at them, but for many years they were in storage and were inaccessible. And I'm really fascinated by Bertha Higgins, and
Mary Jackson is the one that fascinates me.
Except she wasn't a league.
And on Mary Jackson, you mentioned that celebratory dinner when it passed. She called them out at that dinner when everyone's happy and said, she's like, well, don't forget us, and don't leave your colored brothers and sisters behind, and work is left to do. So yeah, it was a very pointed statement.
I have a question about the maternal thrust, and sometimes I don't feel too maternal. The women were voting and holding office in the West before. I think Wyoming might have been one of the first. And many of those women were entrepreneurs. They owned brothels and gambling dens and farms. Did women's suffrage in the West have that same maternal thrust of we're all mothers are going to make our children's lives better?
I think it's more heavily an East Coast and Midwest thing. I think it's really an industrial idea, but also I think maternalism is both a belief and it's a strategy. And so the Western women may not have needed to use it as a strategy because they had other things going for them that allowed them to be pioneers in suffrage.
And what about England, where suffrage was so brutal? Were they also imbued with a maternal sense of we're women and we're going to make life better?
It's an interesting question. I confess that I know it's been many years since I've read about the English movement. Certainly the more radical wing of women suffragists in, like the Pankhurst, we're not talking about that. They're more, civil disobedience.
Right. They were more aligned with, I can't think of her name, but the people who chained themselves to
Alice
a
Paul.
fence. Alice Paul, yeah.
Yeah, and generally the national, the National Women's Party is the more radical wing, and they're pushing less social reform and more constitution and legal rights and feminism.
Can I, I'm looking here at this, and at the bottom it says, independent citizenship for married women. What does that mean?
Yes, because.
I mean, once you married, you lost your
you lost
citizenship?
everything.
I mean, I
You
don't
didn't
understand.
lose your citizenship.
Well, every time I read a newspaper article, it's Mrs.
Oh,
Walter
right.
Johnson.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know her first name, but it's Mrs. Walter Johnson.
So this is a fight that's going on since the early 19th century about, do you maintain, you have this early European concept of coverture that, women's rights are covered by first their father and then their husband, so they don't need it. Then throughout the 19th century, there's push for married women to own property in their own rights, and that there are legal victories of that in the 19th century, but it's not complete. Right. So things like if there was a divorce and child custody, or who controls wages, it's really about married women having legal identities of their own that aren't usurped by their husbands.
If they were divorced early on, the father automatically got custody of the children.
So long as he wanted them.
Yeah.
Well, I
Otherwise
just
he
think
just
it's curious that they use citizenship as if if you.
Weren't you, when you were first married, if you applied for a charge card?
No, they certainly. And I have a funny story about the local league. When I first joined the league, very shortly thereafter, they made me the secretary. And so we would put a yearbook out every year, which would list all the members, okay? And a lot of the members were listed as, like I would be Mrs. James Frucci, and then in parentheses, Martha, okay? And so I was typing it up. Of course, you typed everything in those days. And I thought, well, now that's ridiculous. Okay, we need everybody's name so we can talk to them. So I just put everybody's name in, and boy, was there pushback from these older women. I am always known as Mrs. James Frucci, okay? Yeah. So, but I mean, doesn't that just seem very, I mean, that was in the late 60s.
That's there.
Oh, yeah.
And it's very frustrating for historians because women disappear.
Right.
It's hard to resurrect them. If you don't know their
Actually,
name.
we have one person we've never been, not because she didn't want to change, but we've never been able to get it changed in the
database.
In the database for some reason, and.
Well, and the other issue, obviously there's a lot to panic about, but one of the things that feminists have been concerned about is the SAVE Act, which would say that you have to vote under the name of your birth certificate.
Yes.
With the explicit goal of trying to deny women the right to vote. It may backfire and encourage more women to keep their maiden name, but yeah, there's all sorts of different shenanigans going on about women's right to vote today.
Yeah.
Did the league or suffragists, were they interested in contraception, Margaret Sanger, or were they
No.
they weren't, they didn't talk about it.
Yeah, that would have been seen as too radical, and certainly, especially the NASA ones, they're very concerned with respectability, and denouncing anything radical as being counterproductive for them. So yeah, certainly not birth control.
She was not maternal.
Well, but again, I mean, actually, in my Queer American History class tomorrow, we are reading a chapter from this book, which is all about the queerness of the suffrage movement, and kind of there's a great YouTube video. The author of that book, Wendy Rouse, did an online presentation at URI that's available, and it's really fascinating about how many suffragists live together. They have shared burial plots, and we're basically hiding in plain sight, but especially for the white suffragists, they got much more of a pass at a time period in the 1910s and 1920s when there was increasing understanding about lesbianism and women's sexuality as a whole. It was harder for them to hide than it would have been in like the romantic friendships and living arrangements of the 19th century, but by being respectable middle-class white women, it bought them a lot of benefit of the doubt that Black women didn't share.
Well, that hasn't changed.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well, it wasn't supposed to be respectable for a woman to live alone. I mean, and if you didn't have a husband, you were supposed to live with somebody. So it was sort of, and if that was, I never was clear.
And so this historian's argument is the suffrage movement gives more women the opportunity to live, non-heteronormative lives, to live individually, to live with collectives of people, or to live romantically with another woman.
But it was considered fairly genteel to have a female companion if you were unmarried.
But less so by the 1910s, 1920s, where new scientific understandings of homosexuality are, so things that like in the 1880s wouldn't have blinked an eye, by the 1920s are more suspect because of the changing scientific attention to homo and heterosexuality.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because even up until, fairly recent times, I mean, I can remember, these two adult women living together and, they were just friends. It's like when I was young, and now I think, I bet there was a little more to it than that. But that was just how it was presented.
Yeah, absolutely. It was presented that way.
Yeah. And two men that lived together were just friends.
But for women who didn't want to get married or didn't want to have kids, suffrage gave them
absolutely
career opportunities. Yep. It gave them fulfillment. It gave them community.
Yeah. And I was looking at something when I was reading about that event in 1920 that where they created the League of Women Voters. It was like the 50th anniversary of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and I'm thinking this went on for a long time. A long time. They did not, and it's just when you think about how many causes went on for so long, so openly.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's an important point that suffrage historians make in terms of it being undercovered, especially in the way we teach American history, right. K through 12, and even on the college level, that this is a movement that starts in 1848, and the 19th Amendment passes in 1920. Those are many generations with lots of ups and downs, and almost 100-year movement that deserves more than a paragraph
Right,
in a textbook.
right, yeah, and then the women got the right to vote.
Yes. Well, no. Not only women got the right to vote, Wilson gave women the right to vote.
Yeah.
Races, all of that
Right.
activism.
After he was.
I have another-
After he was tormented.
Your website is called Alexander Street. What's that in reference
So
to?
Alexander Street is just a corporation that hosts a lot of different historical things.
Okay.
So, so the historians that I worked with, their online encyclopedia is housed by
Okay.
Alexander Street. So they're just the corporation.
I thought it might have some reference to some important
Do you have any
event.
thoughts on why the Equal Rights Amendment died?
Well, I mean,
One of them is that the league did not support it
Hated
until
it.
1960s. And,
Really?
and, yeah, it did not, it fell victim to the, well, do you really want your mother and sister and whatever to fight in the to be drafted? That was the big one that I remember.
well, but actually, that entirely, speaks to what I was, talking about today. If their main goal is social reform to protect women and children, the Equal Rights Amendment would have made all that illegal. Or they saw it would make it, so basically this big umbrella alliance comes together to support women's suffrage, but the mass of women, it's really only the radical women who are pushing for the Equal Rights Amendment, and all the kind of more mainstream organizations like I was talking about today, they hated the ERA and fought against it. So like something like protective legislation, which limited like women being able to work at night or only being able to work 10 hours of a shift, the Equal Rights Amendment would have thrown that out.
That was the biggie. I mean,
So the Equal Rights Amendment they saw as a setback rather than progress.
I joined the league in 1968 or 9. And-
Okay, but I guess I should
and
clarify.
we were starting to think about it.
Okay, but I guess just to clarify, do you mean why did it fail in the 1920s or why did it fail in the 1970s?
1970.
Okay, I answered for the 1920s.
But I assume it's the same answer for the 70s.
Yeah,
I mean,
but
it's
the league now,
backlash
so,
against feminism and an insurgent conservative movement that really weaponizes all the ideas about like bathrooms and drafts and you won't be rape legislation. There's a lot of fear mongering.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And then when it wasn't passed, it was really uncontroversial in the early 70s. But then as it dragged on, there's more backlash to feminism and the country gets more and more conservative. And so once that moment was gone, by the late 70s, early 80s was never going to be passed.
Yeah, and isn't that amendment the only one that's had a time limit on it?
Yes. And there's certainly legal scholars that disagree about whether that timeline is binding or not.
Yeah, right. In fact, there's a push now to get that time limit removed, because now it's 38 states have actually passed it, I think.
Well, I think one of the last things that Biden did in his administration to say the Equal Rights Amendment has been passed and it's a foregone conclusion, I don't think people think that he has the right to say that.
Well, and I would also
Right.
say that if given the chance that some of those states that passed it would go back and unpass it.
Yeah.
Right.
There are
Right.
states. Yeah.
You may go in there.
Do you have something you wanted to say, Kathy?
The war
Well,
is.
I have so many thoughts and questions, but one, I was so struck listening to this at the beginning. You talked about maternal care, and I think about the movements in the last couple of decades for women need to be in office because women have something, a unique voice, and I think about, certainly there's been like the Democratic progressive getting women to vote, and certainly here in Rhode Island, you've seen that, all of a sudden, all these women starting running for office after 2016, but then you've also seen a very conservative women's movement. So I was listening to that and hearing those parallels, and I'm curious if you have any, I'm not sure how far your research goes to the present time, but if you can speak to that at all.
Well, my research doesn't go to the present, but also, fundamentally, I think the idea of maternalism is a dangerous one, and the argument that women are almost different species to men, and I think most feminists would agree with that today, and we live in a very different time with our understanding of gender, and so I think separating women out as different from men more likely leads to women being denied rights and full participation in society than it does help them. Mm-hmm. So I think it was very helpful for getting the right to vote, but whether it serves women's interests in general, and certainly, if you think about the 1970s with people like Phyllis Schlafly or like Lauren Boebert today, I think we would say not all women politicians do we think have the best interests of women at heart, and I think most of us don't think that, well, a woman would be less likely to send the US to war. There's lots of hawkish women politicians as well. But I do think that we want a wide variety of people and politicians with lots of different life experiences that will reflect that. And if some of them have been single moms or working women, will bring those experiences with them. But I don't support the idea there's one, inherent ideology that binds all women biologically together.
Well, I always think about, when I think about all the different interests that drive people in the League, it's sort of like when the League was founded, Carrie Chapman Catt looked at the program for the League and said, "It's a kettle of eels."
Well, at the very beginning, we have programs, or actually they're probably also in the Historical Society now, of the classes that the League basically set up and got speakers and that kind of thing just for citizenship classes, because women basically weren't citizens. I mean, if you can't vote, you're in many ways not a citizen. I'm not sure whether they even had, and when I first started to register voters, if a woman, there were still women who had come to the US and married and were naturalized that way, and they had to bring their not the naturalization papers, but whatever, I forget what requirements we had, but you had to bring those if you registered to vote, and you were one of these women that arrived in the United States before 1927, I think it was. And it was so there were various classes of women at that point.
Well, and I think the other thing is, I think we're all here because we support these efforts and think the League is good. On the other hand, both the League and Suffrage have uncomfortable histories. There's a lot of xenophobia, and the League and Suffrage leaders were involved with English language only, laws in Rhode Island, and strong Americanization efforts for immigrants.
But they did at least provide classes.
Yes. But both the temperance and the immigration did have a xenophobic side of kind of reining in what they saw as unruly.
Yeah, and there was the big decision of whether to support Wilson for World War I. and they supported it or withheld their basic lobbying and pushing during World War I as a part of trying to say to everybody, hey, we are Americans.
Yes. Yeah, patriotism, much like paternalism, is a good strategy.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was a strategy,
Yeah.
not a necessarily a thought of what was right or wrong, but a political strategy.
So how was the Rhode Island effort perceived nationally? I mean, you said that he invited the one woman, but in terms of the suffrage, was Rhode Island a big player? Was Rhode Island or just another state, or how would you characterize it?
We have pictures.
Well,
of
let her talk. She's the
Yeah, I know.
yeah. Let me hear what she has to say.
I mean, I think the shorthand is Rhode Island doesn't get a lot of attention for anything and is the overlooked state. It certainly is a pioneer. Rhode Island is the first state on the East Coast to pass presidential suffrage for women in 1917. That gave Rhode Island women the right to vote in presidential elections in 1917, before the 19th Amendment. So the East Coast generally were the most conservative and the hardest for women's suffrage to break in. The West and the Midwest had victories early. So Rhode Island was a pioneer there.
Yeah.
I'm saying that, I don't think other historians say that. And I think it really speaks to,
Right.
they fought for 25 years and organized and lobbied to get presidential suffrage. The fact that there was at least one interracial women's suffrage organization in Rhode Island, I think that makes it unusual.
Yeah.
But again, I don't think that gets a lot of national attention.
Well, certainly not. But I think people might say, "Oh, it's just a small state. It's just be so easy to get everybody to agree, right?"
You're right.
To add to that, there is the picture of Sarah Algeo, or however you pronounce it.
I think it's Algeo.
Yeah, she accompanied Carrie Chapman Catt to the Geneva conference, and that's they came back to the Tennessee thing, with Delaware having denied ratification and Tennessee being the last hope.
Well, you know, they were very well connected. The Rhode Island, that looking back at all the history, it really surprised me to realize people came. Frederick Douglass was a regular visitor, and so was Susan B. Anthony. They kept coming through Rhode Island regularly, and when somebody from Rhode Island asked them to do anything, they showed up without any question. So, you know, I was surprised, but I guess they had more pull than I normally like.
Yeah, I mean, certainly
now.
states like Massachusetts and New York on the East Coast get a lot more attention.
Right.
But yeah, I really love Algeo, and I find her a fascinating character, and she's a troublemaker, and she's constantly either getting kicked out of suffrage organizations or creating her own or splitting off. And
Well, they were always doing that. That's where you get that enormous name, the National American Women's Suffrage.
Yes, that is true. But it seems to always center around her, and she's writing letters to Kat, bitching about the other women.
Right.
You've seen all those.
Yes.
I have not seen those.
So where are they? Are they in at Rhode Island College too? Is her?
No. So most of the research that I've done here is either from the state archives.
Okay.
And the Rhode Island Equal Suffrage Association papers, which is part of the Secretary of State. I've also done a lot of genealogy and online research. The Sarah Algeo writing to Carrie Chapman Catt is available on the Library of Congress website in various. I think some was in the Cat, but yeah. So all this local drama. You know, Algeo's writing for Kat, wanting her to intervene, and then I think the other women are doing that as well. And so Rhode Island was unusual, but most states only had one NASA organization, and Rhode Island had two, and often that was contentious, and they were both under the NASA umbrella, but didn't always agree on strategy or membership or.
Oh, they didn't.
Yeah.
And there was when we tried to look up the incorporation, they were all both. There were two groups chartered trying to be the state.
Right, and then they were racing against each other to be the official
there
one.
were two, so it ends up that the Providence League is the second
you
one.
had sent me records where they were gonna consolidate, and then the next day, the Providence women backed out. And
but the National League said there will be only one state organization. You must have seen that. It's the Historical Society. That was.
Yeah, but Sarah Algeo has a 1925 memoir of her life and her activism and suffrage, which I think is really great. I would like to see if we could get it republished with a scholarly introduction to it.
Cool. All right.
I don't know if there's a market for that, but.
Can we just, if you think about it, 100 years ago, there was this great enthusiasm that women would change the world, and now, more than 100 years later, the voting participation of women is higher than of men. Women are doctors and lawyers and university presidents. We're not U.S. president, but we seem our educational status is higher than men. We seem smarter than men. We are on the ascendant. Have we done what we were going to do 100 years ago and made a kinder, juster?
I would say no.
No, but
I do think we see political gaps in male versus female voting for Trump. You definitely see a gender gap there. But I think right after women's suffrage in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, all those things they promised that women would vote differently, they didn't. And the reality is they voted by race, they voted by class. And not because their husbands told them what to do, but because they had similar interests. So there really wasn't they didn't take dramatically different. I do think we see more of a gender gap in politics today than we did right after suffrage was passed.
Okay.
This is great, thank you.
Yeah, we could go on.
This placard.
And again, thank you to Holly for putting all the Rhode Island bios in one handy webpage.
When